I'm in the business of wanting to resurrect that triumphant beast in you.
Welcome to The Boundless Body, the podcast with a somatic doctor interviewing innovative thinkers about their perspectives relating to the arts and sciences of therapy. Discover The Boundless Body.
Back to the mystery.
Well, I'd like to welcome Elisabeth Kristof to The Boundless Body. Elisabeth, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. And it's an honor to be here. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Me too, Elisabeth. So I'm just going to read off an introduction here and then we'll get started. Elisabeth Kristof is an expert in nervous system health for trauma resolution and behavior change. She is the founder of Brain-Based Wellness, an online platform that trains the nervous system and body to resolve old patterns, improve performance, and increase well-being. She is the co-host of the Trauma Rewired podcast that explores the neurology of complex trauma. Elisabeth is a certified applied neurology and somatics practitioner and the founder of Neurosomatic Intelligence Certification, a course that teaches leading-edge somatic coaching that creates client transformation from the body to the brain. Awesome. So we got lots to talk about, Elisabeth. I'm really excited about this journey. Let's talk about the nervous system. I noticed that on the podcast, you have a picture of the vagus nerve.
We do. Vagus nerve is so popular right now. It's having its moment.
And it's one of my favorite pictures of the vagus nerve. You know, I taught craniosacral internationally for years, and I have like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of slides and images and anatomical pictures and all that stuff. And I have a couple of favorites that are like refrains or something in songwriting. And that image is one of them.
It's such a beautiful image.
It's so great. It really integrates that, you know, that facial infrastructure of nerves with the gut all the way down towards the pelvis. I love it.
Yeah, me too. It really, I think it's a beautiful artistic rendering of it. And it shows how much it weaves through, like you were saying, from our face, our brain to our organs, and just really shows the vastness of that system.
Yeah. So what got you interested in all this stuff, all this neurobiology stuff and trauma resolution?
Yeah, well, I started as a movement practitioner. I had a couple movement studios here in Austin where we worked with athletes or people in chronic pain. And in 2007, I discovered applied neurology, and I knew I really wanted to bring that into our studios with our teacher training, and started doing certifications with a company called Z Health Education, and fell in love with it. I just saw how much difference it made for my clients, especially in chronic pain, to be able to start to work with their nervous system and rehabilitate the nervous system, and went down a long road of education with that. And then experienced a time in my own life where things fell apart, for lack of a better word. I lost my business. I had a partner at the time that was diagnosed with cancer, and I went into being a full-time caretaker for him, and was just under a lot of stress myself. And in that time of stress, started experiencing really severe outputs of my own nervous system, a lot of pain, blacking out. My binge eating got really bad. I've been a lifelong binge eater. And a lot of my own trauma started to come back up to the surface, stuff that I had not remembered or known about. And that pushed me into my own journey of somatic healing, working with a bunch of different somatic practitioners and understanding ACE scores and how trauma lives in the body. And I saw in that time, man, there was this huge application for applied neurology and working with the nervous system at a practical level in the world of trauma resolution and somatics, that there was so much more that could be done with applied neurology beyond just making people run faster and jump higher. And so I started working with practitioners and with my teachers to weave some of this framework of applied neurology into the world of somatics, and have gone down a long journey in myself and with my clients of trying to find practical ways to work with the nervous system to rehabilitate in the world of trauma resolution, so that some of these big outputs that people experience from trauma can start to be shifted in a different way.
Mm. Yeah. So in one of my episodes, I talked with Dr. Barnaby Barrett. He wrote this incredible book on somatics. And in that discussion, we talked about this wonderful book called The Discovery of the Unconscious. It's a classic text in the psychoanalytic tradition. Ellenberger is his name. And in that book, he talks about how the founders of psychodynamics, Jung and Freud and Reich, like the biggies, the big names, all went through what he called an initiatory illness, which, is really a continuation. And Ellenberger talks about it in the book as a continuation of ancient shamanic initiatory rites, where healers were brought to their trades through initiation. And so that's what I hear in your story. You were stripped bare, all these intense things happened. And it's kind of like this initiatory illness thing.
It resonates very deeply when you say that, of having a lived experience that, is embodied, of moving through the world in a body that is carrying this trauma and coming into the places where you really have to face some of that to begin to peel back the layers and get the understandings and the knowledge from that experience. So many times we come into this work from healing ourselves first.
Yeah. Yeah, I resonate with your journey, or at least the binge eating aspects of it, because part of my initiatory illness was when I was in university, when I was doing my bachelor's. I started to get these really rigid forms of eating, really rigid forms of exercise that's now being called orthorexia. And I'm a bit of a unicorn because as a man, I was a binge eater. Statistically speaking, it tends to be, largely scaled towards women there. But I think orthorexia in men kind of shows up in a different morphology, where you have like kind of muscle madness, like
100%.
kind of like, how big is my muscles and how big are my muscles, and like that comparative dynamics there. And so I got caught into that labyrinth of, body image and binge, and then run 10 miles the next day to kind of like account in the ledger for like what I did the night before, something like that. And that was part of my initiatory illness, because I actually started to get really sick after that, cycle after cycle after cycle.
Yes. Yeah. I relate to that so much. And I do think, it shows up differently for different people, but so much of this, the relationship with our body, the relationship with food is so deep in our nervous system responses. And so many of us, I think, face these outputs of restriction, and then the backlash of that, the disordered eating, the body dysmorphia. And really, for me, working through that, the binge eating, which again, like I said, started for me at a very early age. I have a pretty high ACE score. I have some early childhood developmental trauma, and I began to learn that from an early age, that was the best way that I knew how to regulate my nervous system, to come into a more relaxed state, to maybe get some interoceptive stimulus that I was lacking from dissociation. And it really changed my relationship to myself when I began to understand how much all of this was outputs of my nervous system driving that behavior from a little kiddo that did not have a way to find safety and regulation.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I used to teach in Austin quite a bit, and one of the things that I remember fondly, are the taco trucks.
Yeah.
Because they're like
Great
everywhere.
drugs. Yeah.
They're so good. And gosh, what an output that is. You speak a lot about, I've heard you say it several times now, inputs and outputs. And you're kind of framing, or at least how I'm hearing you is that this kind of orthorexic or these obsessive compulsive behaviors are a type of output to the input of trauma. Am I hearing you right in terms of how you're using that language?
Yeah. Well, from a neurosomatic perspective, we really look at everything in terms, this is an oversimplification, but in terms of, our nervous system takes in information about the world around us and about the world inside of us through all of our different sensory input systems, our eyes, the balance system in our inner ear, body mapping system, our interoceptive system, and then the nervous system and the brain get that information in, integrate it, interpret it, and then generate an output. And that output is going to be a reflection of a big question that the brain is always asking: safe or unsafe? And am I moving into a protective mode? Am I moving into something for regulation? Or am I moving into more of a performance presence mode where I can stay connected? I have good range of motion. I have the skills to regulate. And so when we're working with people's nervous system, I'm always first looking at, like, how is the information coming in? What's the quality and the clarity of that information for the different sensory input systems? And can we start to make a change there to then start to shift the outputs, whether that's the behavior or an output like pain or a migraine or an episode of binge eating, rather than cognitively trying to fix that, going back, looking at the inputs, and then looking at how the brain is interpreting and integrating that information, and then trying to make changes there and letting that naturally change the output that follows.
For individuals or couples interested in therapy or counseling, you can sign up for a free consultation or our newsletter for more information on integrative therapeutic modalities.
Interesting. So I'm thinking about initiatory illness as a kind of, well, like for me, the binge eating process was like a loop of inputs and outputs, just like constant pain, creating a new level of output called chronic pain. And my body just hurt and my psyche hurt. And I was just like in this endless positive feedback loop where the pain was just the psychic pain, the bodily pain was just building. And then boom, I just fell apart.
Yeah. I look for and I see so many of those loops in trauma where we have the initial dysregulation, and the trauma wouldn't necessarily be, it would originally be an input, like you were talking about the experience, but then it also is the forces that shape how our nervous system is patterned and how our brain is interpreting and integrating that information. And so to have the initial incident, it repatterns my system to take in information in a different way, maybe with more hypervigilance, more sensitivity. And then that pushes me into these behaviors or outputs that I'm using initially to be adaptive. It could be a trauma response, an episode of binge eating. And then that output also becomes an input, right? And then I'm taking in all of that food. There's also the emotional component of that, the shame and the dysregulation that causes, that then drives more outputs. And it just continues to feed on itself as we go through the world. And that patterning becomes deeper, more ingrained, a more well-worn path in the nervous system.
That's interesting. I'm thinking about pain sensitization, which I'm sure you ran into a lot of that in your early work, right? With athletes in chronic pain.
Definitely.
Where I think we could say that this phenomenon of a new output is produced. That's, like pain. And then that becomes a new input. And then it just keeps on escalating and escalating,
itself.
reinforcing itself. And I'm imagining you still do use movement as an intervention.
Yes, we use quite a few different types of sensory stimulus as an intervention. So it might be some really specific proprioceptive exercises where you're intentionally moving the body through complex nonlinear movements at specific joints and helping the brain to remap that area of the body. Maybe our body map has become a little bit blurry there. And so we want to clear that up with really intentional and precise movements to get stimulation that way. It could be eye exercises for the visual system. could be head movements and balance exercises for the vestibular system, or work for the vagus nerve, and maybe some stimulation of some of the non-myelinated C fibers in the gut to get some of that stimulus to the brain, so that we're continuing to remap these areas of the body and rehab these skills of taking in information. And then, like we were talking about with pain too, also helping our brain not just to be able to get that information clearly, but also accurately. Like, how much threat am I attributing to these signals? What's the response in the body? Can I use tools to regulate and create safety around feeling these signals? And then do that over and over and over again to repattern the experience for someone.
Yeah. So somebody that's caught in a chronic pain dynamic where their nervous system, essentially the image that I've been using quite a bit for chronic pain sufferers is that their brain becomes professional at secreting pain. And so I really like this idea of nonlinear movements because I bring that up with my clients a fair bit. Because movement practices like yoga are great. Love yoga, and it opened up a lot of things for me, but it can tend towards being quite linear, where it's just like,
Yes. And you're just repeating the same patterns of movement in the linear directions over and over.
and it can break some loops, but then it can establish another loop. And what I find with some people is they just need to bring the body into this nonlinear, explorative situation where the joints are being moved in ways that are unpredictable. And I
Yes.
think this is a good way of remodeling the default mode network, right? Essentially, what we're talking about in terms of the interpretive dynamics and the prediction dynamics is that these input output cycles get modeled on a mass scale in the default mode network, and it just becomes a mega loop of
Yes.
interpretation and prediction.
That's right. That's
And
right.
and then so doing these explorative movements really allows the whole system to begin remodeling, yeah?
Yes. And having that novel stimulus is so important. The brain will pay more attention to the novel stimulus. And when we're doing proprioceptive exercises, just like you were speaking about with yoga, we become really patterned into certain movements and especially linear movements. And we'll often go right into the compensations that we would do normally whenever we start doing those movements. So when we're working to rehabilitate the body map, and doing these proprioceptive exercises, they're very small movements most of the time and really targeted to mobilizing one specific joint through its full range of motion in a circular pattern, or it would be maybe like a finger circle, or mobilization of the thoracic spine in a very precise, targeted manner, so that we're really getting the body to mobilize that specific area, not move into any of its compensations, get the mechanoreceptors around the joint to get some stimulus to send that feed up to the brain about this is this area of the body, this is where I am in space, and get clearer communication so that my brain all of the time starts to have a better understanding of where am I in space? Where's my hand going to move to reach and pick up this cup? And I'm making more accurate quality movements all of the time. And then all of my movements are a little bit less stressful for my brain and my nervous system. If I have an old injury in my foot and I would never rehabbed that, my brain's map of where my foot is in space is a little bit blurry, then every single step that I take is a little bit threatening because my brain doesn't know exactly where I'm going to land. Am I going to fall? And so if I can start to remap that through sensory stimulus, through intentional, precise movement, then that starts to clear up. And now every step that I take, I'm adding less stress to my system because my brain knows, okay, I'm going to land here. I'm going to move with accuracy. I'm not going to fall. And now I have less overall stress all of the time, more capacity in my nervous system. And I don't experience that protective output of pain as frequently because my brain's not having to work as hard to keep me safe, to limit my movement.
Nice. That was an amazing riff. It was really cool. I really like it. I got just taken on this inner journey as you were articulating. And I was thinking about things like Feldenkrais
Mm-hmm.
and continuum.
Yes.
So you run into continuum movement?
I haven't, but I've done a lot of Feldenkrais.
Okay. It reminds me a bit of the Feldenkrais where there's really a granular approach to the nervous system where you're working on a nuance. You're on the kind of nuanced fibers in the mechanosensory system to build in nuance in terms of proprioception and how the body is reading out it and tracking itself as it moves through space. And I really like how you brought in this piece about when there's a gap in what the literature is calling the kinetic chain. Have you run into this principle before? The kinetic chain?
Yeah.
When there's a gap in the kinetic chain, the chain that organizes the fluid flow, actually, if you really zoom in on it, it's always going to be a bit jerky. You know what I mean?
Yep.
But still, there's a general kind of fluid flux of movements when the kinetic chain is filled in. And with trauma and other things, we're just living in a society where movement, especially explorative movement, isn't really nurtured. You can get all sorts of gaps in the kinetic chain. And these granular movement styles, like what you're expressing here, like Feldenkrais and continuum, where it isn't really linear either, because nature doesn't really, nature kind of does lines, but it's more like spirals and, just like, so I really love that. And there's some neuroscience to back up how important nervous system granularity is. So being able to do really nuanced movements in the body maps onto emotional intelligence and the capacity to emotionally regulate. So people that have high emotional granularity, and I would extend it based on this discussion to people that have high movement granularity, have a high capacity to regulate emotion.
I really believe that that's true, because I think so much of what trauma does is, for so many people, is the immobility that comes with freeze and shutdown, and that at that deep intrinsic level of our core too, right? The spinal mobility, the movement of the diaphragm, all of these ways that we then mobilize emotional energy and move that through the body, and having that ability to stay mobile and process the emotions, not just cognitively, but through our body, with our vocals, with our breathing, with our movement, is a part of emotional regulation. And if we've lost that movement skill and body mapping and connection to our body, it becomes really difficult to also be able to metabolize emotions and move through to the other side, and not continue to stay in that repressive mechanism of bracing and holding and locking everything in, that then we don't get the natural regulation that we need through emotional expression.
Awesome. One of the things I like to bang on about in this podcast is that only one side of the continuum, or the continuum of self-regulation, I think is really a continuum. And I think there can be an over focus on the regulatory aspects, like slowing things down. But if you really look at the early literature in interpersonal neurobiology, a la Alan Shore, the classic stuff, he's saying, it's not just about slowing down and regulating and getting slow. It's about being able to amplify as well. It's about being able to kind of ride the wave into states of feeling good intensity. Trauma is feeling bad intensity. So I think nervous systems couple intensity and upregulatory states with bad feelings. But one of the things that I love to talk to students about is, hey, no. It's about, a significant aspect is about uncoupling the nervous system from intense states that feel bad, uncoupling intensity from feeling bad, and recoupling it to states of amplification that feel good.
Yes,
So
I think
it's not just about self-regulation, slowing down. It's about, okay, can we amplify and let it rock and roll, the whole thing?
I
Nervous
think
system.
there's so many good points there. And one is I think there's just this general misunderstanding when people talk about nervous system regulation, just broadly among the public, that means that it's kind of a flatline state, that we're going to be calm and passive all of the time. And that's really not a healthy nervous system. Our nervous system shouldn't be a flat line. We shouldn't be stuck in any one particular state. And really having nervous system health is this ability to modulate and have the appropriate response for the situation at hand to be able to be activated and energized and in a sympathetic nervous system state, and then to be able to come down out of that into parasympathetic so that you can rest and repair and positively adapt to that stress. But we're not looking for a life without activation, and definitely not an emotional numbness, but to have the capacity in ourselves to be present for all of those big emotions, to have appropriate responses for things, and then to be able to fluidly move between different states so that we are experiencing life presently.
Yes, sometimes, Elizabeth, when I go to some of these workshops out there about self-regulation, the field of education is in this slow tempo that almost feels like a prison to me at times, where bodies become docile and there's like this tempo that's imperializing. I feel like to show signs of real life out of the grayscale is transgressive.
Yeah, so many things here. One is that everyone's nervous system is so different and unique, and the tempo and the pace and the load of the stimulus that different people need in order to have response and adaptation from their nervous system is it's just different for every individual. And so we really have to be able to understand someone's nervous system is communicating with us, and to be able to validate the exercises, the tools, the processes for the right amount of stimulus for their nervous system, and not just between individuals, but for everybody. Like sometimes I need more mobilization. Sometimes I need things to be moving at a faster pace. I need big expressive movements. I need a lot of different stimulus stacked on top of itself for my nervous system to be able to pay attention, respond, adapt, to create change. Other times it's important to slow down and have that moment of digesting and responding to things. And it just stays varied all of the time.
It's so dynamic. Systems are
Yes.
so dynamic and so polyrhythmic that, just imposing one tempo is not a great idea. In the literature, they talk about some nervous systems are overwhelmed, some are underwhelmed, and some of them toggle back and oscillate between the two. But underwhelmed nervous systems are nervous systems that actually need a stimulus. A lot of these nervous systems aren't going to be well served by the slow tempo stuff. They're underwhelmed. They need stimulus. They need to be able to crack out of the prison and, find those levels of intensity that they have coupled to danger in their nervous system, and somebody to model something that feels different to them in terms of getting that spark back.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm someone myself. A lot of my life, dissociation was a well-worn path for my nervous system. And I had a lot of interoceptive deficits. I could not feel what was going on inside of me. I couldn't sit with that. And in order to start experiencing change, I needed a lot of stimulus at once in order to be able to come out of that state. I needed stuff from my visual system. I needed sensory stimulus. I needed movement. I needed vocalization, all to be happening. And then my nervous system would start to pay attention, re-engage, begin to adapt. And it was a long time of training for capacity before I was also able to sit quietly and drop into my body and feel my breath without immediately dissociating and not being able to be present for the rest of the work.
Yeah. One of the things I loved about Porges's work when I first picked up polyvagal theory, when it came out, they're really grabbed onto this notion that the healthy heart is the variable heart. The healthy heart is one that exhibits micro fluctuation, micro variability.
Absolutely.
And I like to kind of amplify that out to what the nervous system in health expresses, like a kind of optimal variability, a response flexibility. Because with trauma, a lot of the times the flexibility gets undermined. And then we see all these stereotyped neurological patterns. And a perfect example of that, and a very common example, and I'm sure you've seen a whole lot of this, is the eye movements. When somebody is in the middle of a trauma replay, their eye movements will become very stereotyped along very specific vectors on this orthogonal matrix of the eye muscles. And then they'll just kind of keep on going in that same pattern, and it'll be totally stereotyped. And then so it'll happen, in session A, and then 3 weeks later, when the trauma gets triggered again, they'll go back into the eye movement pattern that is exactly the same as session A.
Yep. Yeah. We spend a lot of time rehabilitating the visual system and retraining all of the different visual skills that should be there. Because again, with trauma patterns, we do get locked into having certain movements be very dominant, and then we lose a lot of other visual skills that are really important for our nervous system's health and to be able to bring good, accurate information into our brain. So there's a lot of time not in the trauma, not when talking about the trauma, but just as a daily practice of rehabilitating the visual system, training my peripheral vision, training my gaze stabilization and all kinds of different patterns, doing saccades and smooth pursuits, and really getting a healthy, well-functioning visual system. And then I can begin also to, in the moment of doing the work on the trauma, start to incorporate some of those exercises and repattern the reflexive responses of my visual system, of my nervous system in that moment. But first, I've spent a little bit of time in months prior just turning my visual system back on, strengthening the extraocular muscles, working with those cranial nerves. And so that I'm going into that practice with a nervous system that has capacity to start to repattern and not move into those same behaviors.
I'm thinking about EMDR. Now, I'm trained in EMDR and I use it. I use my own kind of unique expression of it. I have the same complaint with EMDR as I do with yoga, is that, cool, we can think about the trauma, and if the person has a really stereotyped ocular pattern, great, that'll introduce some variability, similar to how yoga can introduce some variability, but then we're back in a linear pattern as we watch and it's like, well, okay, what's going to break that pattern now?
Yep. I love EMDR, and I think it's a really useful tool for people, but there are a lot of other visual skills and eye movement patterns that we can start to introduce rather than just relying on the one particular movement. And also, a lot of people come into the work with deficits in their visual system, and really spending some time rehabbing that. Like, for instance, I have a lot of clients, and I myself had one eye that kind of goes offline, especially when I'm under stress, and it'll just kind of drift away and do its own thing. And so I had to spend some time rehabbing that eye, bringing it back into working together with my other eye, having good function. And then I can start to do something like EMDR. But if I don't rehab that first, even those eye movements, those linear eye movements, when I'm in a stress response, is actually really exacerbating my stress because I have this big visual deficit. And so taking the time to do some of that foundational work can then make these other things more effective and more applicable to people with those deficits. And you have a lot of other visual skills that you can bring in to the practice too.
I'm kind of assuming, maybe this is a bit of a leap. I'm assuming that you're a dancer or have been a dancer.
I used to be an ice skater.
An ice skater. Okay.
Yeah,
So
I
that
was
was
an ice
that
skater.
was a leap. That was an assumption. Maybe based on, you did say movement studios.
Yes, we
And
had Pilates
before.
and movement studios, and yeah, dance was part of that. So you're on the right
Well,
track.
Well, so back in 2003, that was the first time I ever went to Austin. This is where I had this era in my life after my initiatory illness where I went to the mountains of California and I got into all this body work stuff and craniosacral therapy. And then it was Five Rhythms dancing. And I met with a partner from Austin that was coming for a workshop in California out here. And I went to Austin and I got engaged in the body choir community. Have you ever heard of body choir?
I haven't, but I love that name.
Body choir is so cool. So it was like 2003. It was like one of these archetypal times in my life where my body could really experience the delight of variability in tempo with the music, where, you didn't have instructors coming in to say, putting the body in line and saying, this is the way that the body needs to move, not choreographed movements, but spontaneous movements that allow bodies to be a body choir, right? As a community. And there's this guy there in the community that I remember thinking to myself, wow, this guy is really free. And he's probably still, body choir was now we have ecstatic dance, which is kind of propagated worldwide, but body choir was there before that. So people in Austin were doing this groovy thing, and I just remember how free these bodies were. And I'm thinking to myself, gosh, I want to be that free. I want to be able to support that type of variability and that freedom. So anytime I come into an intervention that has linear ordered dimensions, I'm going to use them as a stage appropriate intervention. But ultimately, I want to encourage variability. I want to encourage vitality. This is one of the answers to the questions that this podcast asks at its foundation, which is, what can a body do? We work a lot with trauma, but then what?
Yeah. I think that's it for me, right? Like that freedom in the body to be able to express and move in all kinds of beautiful patterns, and really, like the name of that program suggested, like having your body be the instrument. I do a lot of vocal toning and vocal work too, and movement. And I think as we work with our nervous system to undo some of these restrictive patterns that are, they were there, they were adaptive, they served us for some time, but we want to move beyond that. And as we gradually repattern ourselves and re-educate our nervous system, that's it, right? So that we can move through the world freely and express our essence through our body, through our voice, through our movement. And I think the potential is limitless of what our bodies can do. I mean, they're incredible.
Yeah, well, you've mentioned this fundamental binary of safe, unsafe, where the nervous system is just constantly scanning at almost a nanosecond scale, millisecond for sure, millisecond scale for signs of potential danger. And if the nervous system is sensitized to signs of danger, then it's going to just keep on reading out signals of danger. In fact, it's going to predict and project them.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, the thing about being such neuroplastic beings, it's wonderful. And it's also, we are really shaped and patterned by our past experiences. And for many of us, that we have developmental experiences that it doesn't have to be a quote unquote big T trauma. It can be a series of small events over time that lead our nervous system to be in a state of hypervigilance. And like you said, scanning for that threat all of the time, changing the way that we filter information, the way that our brain interprets other people's facial expression, their vocal tone, the way we connect with other people. And so, trauma, I think, really is it's not the event, but it's the pattern that's left in our brain and our nervous system that then shapes how we are experiencing the present world. It's living in the now, creating that experience, and then continuing to reinforce that pattern, like we talked about before, because we do find the evidence of that threat when our brain is interpreting it that way. And then our reactions create more of those experiences. And it's just finding ways to interrupt that, to provide novel stimulus, to create safety around that stimulus, and to do that repeatedly so that then we adapt in a different way.
Yeah, no, I think it's responsible to keep in mind that there's cognitive negativity bias. Like, this is a fact of nature. If there's a neutral stimulus, our nervous systems are biologically wired to valence that and lean towards, this could be dangerous. And I think that, that maps onto or has a close neighbor that we could call maybe an unsafety bias, like negativity bias and unsafety bias. I mean, I could come up with a little bit more of an elegant term for it, but you get what I'm saying, right? That
100%.
that people that are out there just kind of saying, oh, let's just keep it positive or something like that. It leaves this fact of nature out, and which is really important, I think, for humility, but just to understand that there's a profound thing that we're up against when we're saying, all right, let's move away from the bias towards, reading a cue in the environment as unsafe, and to just understand how deep and old that tendency is.
Yeah. And not cognitive, right? Most of the interpretation that you're talking about, the filtering and the decision of safe and unsafe, is happening far below the level of our consciousness. It's not happening in the cerebral cortex. And so when we just try to override that with thinking, I'm going to think positively, I'm going to shift the way this is safe. Why am I reacting this way? It's understanding that it's deeply ingrained wiring into our system, and the way that our brains and our nervous systems are built is to protect us first and foremost, and that unknown is always going to be a little bit threatening because our brains need pattern recognition to generate our predictions and keep us alive. And so I think this is a lot of what we were talking about with the nonlinear movements, and beginning to gradually introduce novel stimulus, new types of stimulus, different skills of all of our different sensory input systems, so that as we are moving through the world, taking in information, it's not always a new experience for our brain. I've moved this way before. I've practiced these skills. I've had these challenges to my balance, and now it's less threatening because I'm practicing it on a daily basis and making my system more familiar and comfortable with navigating that input.
So I'm a lover of the cerebellum. This is a primary area of research for me. I go on and on and on about the cerebellum in my book. And
I love that.
Yeah, right? Because it's what sequences and predicts. It is like a core sequencer and a core predictor. It's part of the default mode network. And when we're doing this stuff that, in the literature, it's called resequencing work. Levine calls it smoothing out. Work with the kinetic chain. All of these converge on cerebellum computation.
Yeah, absolutely. All accuracy, balance, coordination, all the integration that happens in the cerebellum. And I would love to hear more about this from you, because I'm just starting to look into this, that there's more research coming out too about emotional regulation and cerebellum deficits, and how when we have deficits in our cerebellum, that also has a huge impact on our ability to regulate our emotional landscape as well.
The cognitive cerebellum, the emotional cerebellum, there's mirror neurons in the cerebellum. The cerebellum is a underrepresented region of the brain. It's like something like 85% of the volume of the brain is in this mighty mouse area.
Yes, so many
And
neurons. connection with
So
it.
it's really a monster. And, there's all sorts of stuff that happen, especially developmentally, like as we're learning the meta sequences, like, for example, it's like a library of sequences in a way. If you think about it, to brush your teeth, that takes a while to sequence. Like there's a
It's so
lot.
complex.
Oh, yeah, it takes a lot of really granular coordination of the neuromuscular systems to actually do the thing. And that takes quite some time. And by the time the default mode network is functionally online between the ages of 9 and 12, there's a lot of learning to do in terms of, and the cerebellum as a developmental organ is fundamental to establishing those core sequences.
Absolutely.
Also, we run into this problem sometimes where things kind of get over sequenced. And I think trauma is a great case for that. Now, I know in the literature that the efficacy of trauma resolution work fundamentally involves engagement with the cerebellum. Okay. So
Yes.
if we're not, essentially from that literature, where it's basically saying, if we're not engaging with the cerebellum in terms of trauma resolution work, no nada. No nada.
Yeah. I think it's so important. Often don't see the link, and again, not practitioners, but just everyday people who are working with their trauma, how much their body displays the trauma patterns and then the state of their nervous system through their movement patterns, and how much you can see about where the deficits are in people's brain development and nervous system development by the way that they move, by their gait, by their refined motor skills. And you can really use that as a practitioner as a window into where are areas of the brain that have been underfueled, under resourced, where do I need to give more stimulus to, and coming up with ways to work directly with the nervous system through coordination exercises or movement patterning that will have an impact on the cerebellum, on its function, and start to help that area of the brain get more fuel, get more activation, and really kind of intentionally training it through direct stimulus. There's just so much opportunity there to be able to use that as a window to see how is this work working, what changes are happening in their nervous system by watching the way that they move.
Yeah. This is a bit of a leap, but not a leap outside of cerebellum processing. People with cerebellum developmental issues in the earliest stages of embryonic and fetal development are 40 times more likely to develop autism.
That's fascinating.
40 times more likely. So one way of, and I write about this in the book, one way of framing autism spectrum disorders is it's this auditory cerebellar sequencing disorder. Now, not just auditory, but it tends, because there's so much auditory hypersensitivity that goes on in autism spectrum disorders. I think that is a common place to go awry, is in auditory processing. Of course, social processing as well, the capacity to imitate complex motions, and things like that are, non-neurotypical brains. They just do that different. They can't sequence it like a typical brain does. It sequences in other ways. It does different types of cerebellar sequencing.
Yeah, that is a really fascinating statistic there. And something that I've been exploring a lot is the overlaps between complex trauma, developmental trauma, and neurodivergence, and how, really having complex trauma is having a type of neurodivergence, because the way that our brain processes information is going to be changed by that stress load during our development. There's real impacts on brain function, integration of sensory inputs. And so being able to work with these systems is really an important part of rehabilitating the effects of the complex trauma. And I think there's just a lot to consider as someone with complex trauma, learning about neurodivergence and ADHD and autism, and why there would be so much overlap between those two, because there's so many of the changes are the same changes that you see occurring in a neurotypical brain in terms of sensory processing.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you said it before that our sensory systems are constantly bringing in fragmented information, the eyes, the ears, the tactile system. All this information is coming into various superhighways. Cerebellum is putting a lot of that into sequenced order. And then when you have trauma, when there's autism spectrum disorders, it's just a different way of sequencing. And sometimes that sequencing is quite fragmented, not just in terms of the neuromuscular system, but also narratives, which is often the case, right? We're talking with somebody, they go into a trauma vortex, their narrative goes all over the place. It's not just with trauma, right? I think, I do couples therapy too. And when couples start arguing, the coherence starts to tank, right?
Definitely.
When we have an argument with our partners, right? It's kind of like, it just kind of like ratchet around, and it's really hard to find the coherence sometimes as intensity ramps up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we are experiencing a trauma response, one, our fuel and activation is really being redirected from our higher order thinking systems into our survival brain, into the brainstem, in engaging in these responses. A lot of times we will freeze. We'll start to lose our cognitive abilities. We'll start to lose our vocal abilities and movement capacity. And so, whether that's like an F response trauma reaction or in an emotional flashback, everything, there's not just the cognitive component of that, but there's the emotional and the physical, and it's all happening at once. And so my whole system is changing into a different state, a different way of being when I'm in the middle of that argument, right? I'm not the same person. My brain is not taking in information or reacting in the same way. My body is having a different response, and my limbic system is in a different state. And so the whole landscape, externally and internally, has really changed to a totally different new reality.
Yeah, you hear it in this classic phrase, I don't know what came over me.
Mm-hmm.
Things just get more and more stereotyped, and more that we go down into the reptile brain. And it's almost like it's just like this repetitive, non-varied, non-variable statement that goes something like this. I'm right. I'm right. I'm right. I'm right. But it's not just I'm right. It's like you're in trouble for being wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. We get in the place. For me, it's more of like, I have to leave. I have to get out.
Well, it's a different strategy, right? I'm out. I'm out. I'm out.
Run. So it's, and then you think back and you're like, why couldn't I just say the thing? Why couldn't I stay present? And that was for me why it was really important to start to have some non-cognitive strategies in those moments of giving my nervous system different stimulus, working really at that nervous system level to start to create a change internally and in the way that my brain is receiving information. Because for so long, I would imagine, rehearse, try so hard to show up differently in these situations. And I just couldn't at that level of only trying to come at it from that cognitive perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. Nervous systems, they tend to organize, I guess if we're connecting with the relational field, and the relational field tends to fragment into approach behaviors and withdraw behaviors, like I'm out versus kind of like I'm in and I'm coming towards you and I need you to see something. I need you to see something. Yeah. And then I guess someplace in between that kind of toggles back and forth in an ambivalent pattern, kind of caught somewhere in between
Yes.
approach and withdraw.
The
Yeah.
very fun, disorganized manifestation of oscillating back and forth. Yeah.
It's a type of looping that we were talking about before, like a big loop. Like if we take the avoidance pattern, which is, I think statistically converges towards men in some ways. I mean, all I know is that clinically when I'm working with couples, the avoider a lot of the times tends to be the guy.
Yeah.
The stonewaller, the withdrawer, boom, that wall goes up. I'm out. I'm out.
Yep.
I'm out. Anytime emotional information comes up or emotional intensity, I'm out.
Yeah. Yeah. I think my partner and I have flip-flopped of that. I'm definitely the I'm out, dissociate or run away, and he's the move into conflict, address it, resolve it, maybe a little more fight energy there. And it has been such a process of one, just learning that about
Yeah.
ourselves and each other so that we can have compassion for each other and for ourselves. Like when I'm in that place of being like, okay, I'm just experiencing a well-worn path. It's an output of my nervous system. Like not be so self-critical in those moments. And then learning little ways to like give space and come back slowly, give other types of stimulus, work on breathing or a vision exercise or sensory stimulus or whatever it is that my system might need in that moment. And then gradually repatterning that so that as we move into these same, because there's always going to be conflict. And as we come into those spaces over time, giving the nervous system and the body new experiences with that. I mean, good reps of a different safe experience that then it can call on in the future.
Yeah. The irony, I like to say that the paradox of healing is that we're allergic to healing. And these are perfect case in point here, because when we're caught in a loop of avoidance and detachment, for example, like when I'm caught in a loop and I'm like doing the silent treatment on my wife, and I'm just like, I'm just caught in a loop and I'm so resistant to the new. And I think it's really important to not, when our partners are going there, to not take it too personally.
Oh my gosh,
That
that helps so
our
much.
partner is in a super primitive space that's literally allergic to what's new.
Yeah.
It's so hard, isn't it, when we're in that loop to even find some micro variability in the facial expression.
It it really is because once we've gotten to that point, it's like I definitely don't have the capacity in that moment to like try something new, to take a different action. I'm just running on the pattern, the survival pattern. And for me, a lot of times it's been just allowing myself to have that, to go through it. And then after the fact, be like, okay, this is what happened. Now I can look at it with some altitude. Were there any earlier signals? Could I have interrupted it somewhere before I got all the way to here? And learn from it and repattern a little bit more in the meantime, give myself a little bit more capacity, and then just have some grace that like it is going to happen sometimes, person moving through the world and embody with an ACE score of 6. And sometimes these patterns are going to get activated and that's okay. And then I can just gradually keep doing the repatterning work and having that lens of compassion, both like you said, for yourself and your partner, so that you don't take it as personally and just allow it to be the nervous system doing what it does.
Yeah. It's not even reptile brain. It's like Cambrian brain or something like that.
Yeah.
It's like over 500 million years old.
Yes.
And what are the chances, Elisabeth, that two people that are caught in that loop are going to be able to create a new relational factor in that moment? Like,
Unlikely.
unlikely. So that's often why the strategy in couples therapy is take a break.
Yep. Take a break.
Yeah.
Take a break. And then in moments of more safety and regulation, address things and do them in little chunks. And then, for me, there is a lot of, I have a daily practice of working with my nervous system. I'm constantly training it to increase its skills and capacity so that, those moments of being pushed into that place are fewer and further between because
Mm,
my stress load all of the time is not as high as it used to be because I've
mm.
rehabbed so many of these deficits that were causing that daily stress load. And sometimes it will still happen. And that's also just part of being human.
Yeah, it's useful. I love this image that you shared before where there's elements, there's regions of the body that are absent. And so as you do work over time to fill in the kinetic chains, you have more organic material available to you to process the intensities of experience.
So well said. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's,
And that's useful, right? Because things get intense.
they really do, and even just coming back into your body. If you're someone who's been dissociated for a long time, that was a well-worn protective path. And the first time I started to experience some of these things, a moment of conflict or setting a boundary or even having an emotional flashback and staying present in my body to feel those experiences without dissociation was very overwhelming. It's very scary. And so also giving myself practices around that and time for coming out of that phase and practicing my emotional regulation skills, my vocalizing, my movement. It's just been really important because it's a big journey to live an embodied life, and that intensity that you were talking about before it is something that I want. It's a beautiful part of this human experience, and it's a lot sometimes. So just giving yourself some space with that too.
Yeah. Your story portrays very well this principle that I talk about a lot in class with students, which is like there can be a tendency in the somatics community to basically kind of implicitly say the body's where it's at. So that's where we need to be. So let's go there because it's safe. You know what I mean? And then, so there can then be this like catapulting of people that are not ready yet to go into, they don't have the tolerance, they don't have the neural structures, they don't have the capacity to be embodied. So we need to take it slow. I work with the symbolic register for a while with people. I can't just assume, the principle is we can't just assume that a person is ready for embodiment, like right now.
Yep. That's actually one of the biggest reasons that I put together the training in the first place was my experiencing with somatic experiencing, in that I really valued it. I understood that I wanted to process all of this and that it was really important to my healing. And when I would go to do somatic work, it was really challenging for me for a long time. One, I couldn't feel the sensations. I think I had alexithymia, and I just couldn't get there when people would ask me to experience something. And then when I did, eventually I would have really violent reactions from my body. I would get a rash all over, my joints would swell up. I have autoimmune and that would get really bad. And
Mm.
I realized like there's work to do with my nervous system. I need to work on my interoceptive system. I need to work on my respiration, heal some of my visual deficits, use my neuro tools around these sessions so that it can be safe, because I do want to be able to do this work. I do want to be able to process this somatically, and I have to do it in a way that supports my nervous system in having the capacity to do it so that I'm not making myself sick in the process.
Hmm. Yeah, one of the interesting things that I ran into also in the literature is that mm, people that have been subject to trauma and complex trauma, the dynamics of third person consciousness is actually safer So the dissociative space is a constructed world of safety,
Yeah.
and right. And we can't just assume, all right, the body is just the place that you need to be and then kind of coerce people into the body. There needs to be a kind of halfway house.
Absolutely.
And for me, it's doing a lot of work with symbolism and third person awareness. I do a lot of imagery work and things of that nature to kind of meet a person where they're at first. Okay. They're in the dissociative safe zone. Hey, let's connect there. Let's talk about dreams. Cause a lot of dissociative types are actually have a great imagination.
Yes.
So I'm going to meet them in that imagination zone. And we're going to work from the third person perspective for quite some time before we're going to actually get into the embodiment. And I'm just meeting, the literature says this is the safe place to go. So that's just where I go.
That's beautiful. I think it's really valuable to have other ways of meeting someone where they're at. And yeah, don't take that protective world away when somebody's not ready and they don't have the tools or the capacity to go there yet.
Yeah. I was thinking about shaking can be quite useful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you shaking in your practice?
I do shake in my practice. Yes, I do
Yeah.
a lot of shaking, a lot of vocalization, and a lot of just, expressive movement, how it comes. But definitely, I will have periods where in an emotional release, my body goes trauma shake, and I am very comfortable letting it do that at this point and trusting that process.
I feel tempted, Elizabeth, to ask for an example of a shaking plus a vocalization, but I don't want to. I don't want to.
Podcast. Where's the moment?
All right, it's all good. I just feel tempted. Maybe I'll do it.
Yeah, I mean,
But because the talking faces in social media world, one of the things with trauma is like there's like this traumatized face. And in a way, that's the face of social media. It's just like we sit on our podcast, don't we? And we just do this thing.
yes,
So
much.
we talk about trauma, and it's like it's almost as if even though we're talking about trauma, we're kind of propagating this lack of variability, right? And it's just like we need to shake things off. That's what the body does after. That's what mammalian bodies do.
Absolutely.
After trauma. They just
Yep. Yep. I'm sure that after this recording, I will do some movement, thinking and expressing, because it's stressful it's just a stressful thing to sit and put your ideas out into the world and to perform in front of people. And yeah, I think there is not a lot of exampling, demonstrating of what those processes look like when we're just sitting here having a conversation, talking about some big, heavy things. There's going to be some stuff that needs to be moved through the body too.
Yeah. Fritz Perls had this wonderful term called aboutism, that we have this tendency to distance ourselves through talking about things. And so we just describe. And there's a good place for that, to keep some distance and some altitude. But like it can end up just being talking about all the time. And it's like, well, what about real time? What about, okay, what does that look like in real time?
Yeah.
I think that there's a one of the reasons why the social nervous system and the nervous system is such a mess in humanity is it's become kind of socially taboo to do the thing that we're wired for after a big event, which is just, be crazy, shake it off, and then it's become socially taboo to do. I had an earlier podcast discussion with a professional clown trainer. And I'm a clown trainer. You probably don't know that about me. I train clowns.
I love this. So many.
This is one of the right. That's one of the ways because there could be so much order involved in aboutism, so much order involved in EMDR, and we've been talking about variability and how important variability is, because that's what a healthy organism expresses. And If you think about it, yeah, there's variability in content in the social media world, but like in terms of the expression, we're just,
Yes.
you know, and this is why I love the clown and how I bring in the clown sometimes and, teaching students, hey, let's see if we can keep it light. It's a razor edge sometimes, right? Because traumatized bodies, that it's not funny. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like, but also there's a urge. I don't know if you've had this in clinical practice. Have you ever had this moment where you're just doing really, really heavy trauma resolution work and then the person just bursts out laughing?
Yes. Yeah. I've been that person.
Isn't that awesome?
Yes.
I love that.
It's wonderful because it's also like that all these emotions, they're all on one big spectrum, where there's the grief, there's also the joy and the connection. And as we mobilize one, others rise to the surface too, as I'm allowing my grief to come through, my heart is also opening and I'm experiencing more connection and possibly more joy. And sometimes it all comes at once. And it's just not so compartmentalized as I think sometimes it's laid out to be.
Yeah. I'm also interested, informal research that I talk about a lot is the Tingle response.
Mhm.
Do you experience that goosebump response in life and clinical practice? How does that show up for you?
Yeah, I think there's this is just me going on about what I see with people and from my own experiential knowledge, not from any research. But it seems to present in different ways, right? Sometimes people can get numbness and tingling, which I think can be a protective output of the nervous system as their system is maybe getting overwhelmed, similar to pain,
Uh-huh.
like that feeling of pins and needles or losing sensation in an area of the body or itching as a variation of a pain response of like, this is too much stimulus. Something about this is threatening and I'm exceeding my capacity. And this is like a flag of, hey, we're moving into threat territory. But there's other times too where I think when I am having a conversation with someone and we're really hitting on some truths or there's a lot of connection where I will experience that goosebump sensation or just the feeling of energy moving through the body is almost like an enhanced sensory experience. And I think they're sort of two separate experiences.
Awesome. I'm so glad that you articulated it that way, that the nervous system can couple the experience with defensive states, with not feeling safe, or it can couple it to feeling wonderful. And one of the things that I believe really strongly about is that trauma resolution work is uncoupling and recoupling work. So that you have sympathetic and parasympathetic system. Sympathetic system gets kind of a bad rap as the fight flight system. I like to call it the fight flight frolic system.
Yeah, it's all about that.
Like we like to frolic, let's play, just like,
Right.
come on, let's clown around, let's play. But in the traumatized nervous system, the sympathetic system gets coupled to danger,
Mm.
coupled to states that don't feel good. And now I'm kind of framing the negative aspect of the tingle response is that kind of where there's a coupling to negative states. And then work over time would be uncoupling it from the bad experience and recoupling it to the good experience that states of awe that arise in good conversation or in an encounter with nature or with great music or something like that. And similarly, the parasympathetic system, especially the emergency brakes, the primitive vagus, a lot of that, of course, in traumatized bodies is coupled to feeling subjugated, feeling horrible, feeling miserable, feeling, just the worst. But Porges's work basically says that same primitive system, that defense system, is the same system that's mobilized during, wonderful feeling states of surrender, like during sex and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So then it becomes an uncoupling of the system from the defensive elements and a recoupling to the stuff that feels wonderful. Like that's sort of easy to say, but it's hard to
that
do
goes in
that work,
process,
right?
and it's something I'm so fascinated by somatic overcouplings and how to start to parcel that apart. And I think a lot of what you were doing with the numbness and tingling of just being able to explore the sensation and just starting to examine it as a sensation. What else might it be like? Where else does it show up? And just starting to play around with that. I have so many clients. I work with a lot of people with sexual trauma and early developmental trauma, and there's such an overcoupling of pleasure and shame. And
Yeah.
so how do we
Yeah.
start to work with that to, yeah, explore sensations as a variety of experiences so that the same patterns aren't occurring over and over again?
I just had the tingle response just now
Mm.
because, I think this is an extraordinarily important topic because there's so much shame that can get wrapped around because a lot of these sexual encounters are with beloveds, and it's like some of that stuff feels good. We're an organism. Like, some of that stuff feels good.
It,
Like not all of it. So it gets in this convoluted tangle of shame and not feeling good and feeling abused, but inside, like wrapped up into it is some of the good feelings.
Yep.
And then the whole system just gets toggled into a coupling and categorizes all of it
Yep.
as bad,
Yep. And then
unsafe.
it translates into so many areas of life when we have that overcoupling of shame or restriction or any kind of F response with pleasure. It doesn't just happen with sexual pleasure, but then moments of ease, relaxation, enjoying food, connection with other people. And we get so easily triggered into these other responses, and it can be really disruptive to life. Like you said, a lot of times it's with family members or with loved ones, and those bonds and that intimacy it's very complicated in how it all gets mixed together in the brain, and really having a delicate process of starting to, can I, I don't have to go right to intimate pleasure, but can I start to feel
Yeah.
good with giving my feet some sensory stimulus? Can I just start to feel those sensations and allow any sensation to be pleasurable? And can I eat this bite of chocolate and have a different reaction to that? And then gradually re-educating over time.
Yeah. Like getting a new blueprint,
Hmm.
right? It's like we're kind of like detectives sometimes, right? Where it's like, okay, that chocolate, not this one,
Yeah.
but this one, when it hits the taste buds, then I kind of get this tingle response that feels good. We have a blueprint now.
Yes. One.
We're not even close to uncoupling sex yet
Yes, exactly.
because there's huge trauma there, but we're starting to then build a blueprint of, that tingle response. That can feel good. Now let's try it with music now.
Yes.
And couple that to, movements that have variability to them. And we're kind of building a blueprint, building a map. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. I love that so much. And I think a lot of times we'll say all the brain needs is one good rep, like to know that something is possible, one experience of that. And then it's like, oh, this other door is open. There's a new way to be. And then gradually building on that in time.
Wow. We could just keep going.
I know.
I don't think I've even looked at my outline once, Elizabeth. That's
There's
pretty amazing.
so much we could explore.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Amazing. Oh, there was this. Now, mind you, this isn't coming from my list. It's just coming from this really
I
dynamic
love it.
discussion that we're having. I ran into a case recently that was really the first time I've ever experienced somebody that he has deja vu 4 times a week,
Wow.
like average.
Wow.
Like this person has deja vu like all the time. And what I was surprised to find, which was very counterintuitive to me, is that he has it coupled to a negative experience.
Interesting.
So deja vu is a loop, is a kind of output of a bad experience. And that was mind blowing for me because I always kind of assumed a bit that deja vu was either neutral or leaning towards, wow, what a mystery. Wow, this is really interesting. I don't know how to explain it. And of course, you wouldn't be surprised knowing, the literature that you're in your practice, that this person has CPTSD.
Yeah. It seems almost like a really extreme form of like prediction and predicting threat and having that kind of like, but when I can predict something, it's like an ominous feeling something bad is about to happen, and that hypervigilance of prediction leading to past experiences of something bad happening.
Yeah. If we really get down to it, stimuli are generally fairly neutral, unless it's a really
Yeah.
obvious,
Right.
okay, saber-toothed tiger or
Right.
something like that, ruffling the leaves, and we hear that or see it
Right.
or something like that. Then that's
Hard
not a
time.
neutral stimulus, right? But the rustling of the leaves itself, just by itself, that's a pretty neutral
Yeah.
stimulus. And I used to think of deja vu that way. And there's a way that I can think of the tingles that way. And often I think my bias was towards the positive in both of these, like because of my own experience, right? Like when I get the tingle response, it's almost always in good feeling situations, but there's some outliers where somebody walks into the room and I'm like, ugh,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
and then I get tingles, or like watching a horror film or something like that. And I'm like, ugh, ugh, ugh.
Kind of. Yeah.
But I've never had the experience of having deja vu that is negative, or, like where the thing comes in and I'm like, I've been here before. Isn't this weird? And something bad is about to happen, because that's what this person experiences, that predictive element where the neutral is not, it's coupled to a predictive apparatus, a predictive loop that's like, okay, something bad is going to happen. Let's mobilize all the defense strategies. So then we're back to uncoupling work. So that's the work that we're doing. Because I know that he's going to do it. He's going to have a deja vu 4 times.
How do we start?
And now he's starting to neutralize it. He's starting to kind of lean towards, when the deja vu comes, I have some choice. I have some variability. I have some opportunities to play here, work with this.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I would be curious if like past experience was that he had those moments of deja vu and it was in a dangerous time, something bad did happen, and then that really imprinted,
Yeah, well, we could hypothesize that based on all the literature, right? And that's the hypothesis that I'm holding in the background,
Yeah.
and it's got clinical value, right? Because his life is getting better.
Yeah.
He's experiencing more joy when it happens now. So if the hypothesis isn't right, in a way, it doesn't matter. It's still working.
Yeah.
you
Yeah,
know?
totally. Totally. We don't always have to know to repattern. That's
Yeah.
the beautiful thing about working with the brain and the nervous system, is that you don't always have to dive back into the events or to understand. Even you don't have to remember everything in order to recognize the patterns and begin to repattern, recouple.
Yeah. I'm thinking about one more topic, and that's the topic of fascia. And maybe we can talk, because you've mentioned mechanoreceptors. Fascia is important. There's
Yes.
so many neurons, and, that are feeding into the insula, and this whole interoceptive modeling in the brain. And there's kind of feedback and feed forward loops in the fascia.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we can just kind of have that. It's a big topic to kind of close with, but I just want to, because fascia, of course, is, it's the glue that holds everything together.
Yes.
And what can you tell the audience about what you learned about fascia, and how that can, stretching the fascia and so on, can integrate with kind of trauma resolution and increasing variability over time and all that?
So we do a lot of like fascial mobilization or fascial openers that we gradually work into. And a lot of times it would be something I would do with someone prior to a session. If I know I'm going to talk about, or if I know someone has a really hyperactive shame response, or we're going to be going into some territory where that might come up and their body's very used to bracing, maybe prior to the session, doing some fascial openers or gentle mobilization in that way to kind of prepare their body and their nervous system to retain more mobility, and doing that regularly over time. With fascial work, really all of the neuro work is that you want to do it slowly, little bits over time, and build up, because those patterns are there for a reason. And if I go after it too much, too hard, if I'm going to get my foam roller and dig after it, like my 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 brain has created that restriction protectively for a reason. And if I'm pushing too hard, I'm going to get a response of more restriction and more bracing that's going to reinforce that pattern. So I have to keep building the capacity and gradually opening and releasing and mobilizing over time in the level that feels safe. And like you talked about before, it's different for everyone. Everyone's nervous system responds differently to different amounts of stimulus and movement. So just really being mindful of how their body does respond to that, and calibrating it so that it's the right dose for that individual nervous system, and then allowing it to build on itself. It is really important to work with fascial mobility, the lymphatic system. Sometimes we do nerve glides and nerve
Mm.
mobilization, because there are biomechanical issues that need to come into play when you're doing this work.
Yeah, and the fulcrum for the whole fascial system is the diaphragm. Right? A lot of the stuck patterns, of course, is in breathing.
Yes.
We clamp up when we're put upon or feeling like we're in this defensive shape. Our breathing volume goes way down. The diaphragm basically stops spanning the fascia through the whole organism. And then we're kind of going into this gesture, which, I'm thinking about body image too. Like people that kind of have like a shamed gesture to like their whole body, right? It's kind of like an expression of a bent out of shape body image.
Yeah. Curled
And
in,
like just,
great,
yeah,
protective.
just kind of introducing the breath. And I like how you're just, let's titrate it. Just this powerful medicine movement. Hey, let's just get a
Yeah.
little bit of movement in there, because I focus a lot on the neurology of the face. The joke that I like to tell students is our job as somatic practitioners is to unfuck the face.
I will.
Because there's so much of an identity matrix in the face and so much posturing in the face. So I'll get people to kind of do facial yoga,
Mhm.
but we're not going to do like, like big time, like scorpion pose, whatever the equivalent is in the face, scorpion
Face
pose. We're, yeah, we're going to just do a little bit at a time. And, consistent with Reich's insight, the great somatic psychologist Wilhelm Reich, we really need to focus on these areas: the eyes, the mouth, and the throat, because so much wiring and it's so dense here and so much happens here
Yeah.
that, just we got to introduce movement at a really slow pace, held in the balance with what we were talking about before. Sometimes slowness is, for the underwhelmed bodies, is really boring and like feels like a prison.
Yep. Yep. It's always about that calibration. And I think what you said about the diaphragm is so important. So much of the foundational work that I do with people is mobilizing the diaphragm, doing diaphragm stretches, diaphragm stimulus, because we can't get out of a lot of these other patterns if we're still locked down in the diaphragm. And that's one of the first places that constricts and gets held locked with stress and trauma. It impinges the vagus nerve. It affects the conductivity of that nerve. It's just so important to work with the diaphragm and the breath as we're doing this work for everything else to be effective. And then, yes, 100% on working with the tongue, the mouth, all of the cranial nerves. I do a lot of cranial nerve stimulus and facial and jaw movement and tongue exercises. And these are some of they're kind of silly, and they seem really small, but they're the most impactful for people. Is, the tongue exercises, tongue stretching, vibration stimulus on the tongue. And it's incredible what a huge difference it can make to rehab the face, the mouth, the vocals. It's
The
just
vocals.
huge.
Yeah. Sometimes the final frontier seems to be the vocals because we can like get a lot of variability going elsewhere,
Mm.
but then the vocal thing just goes, and then we're another 6 months of therapy or a year of therapy is about bringing variability to the vocals.
It has absolutely been my final frontier. I've spent the last few years really in my vocal practices, working with my diaphragm, my vocal cords, my pelvic floor, and the interplay between those. And it's amazing to me how the more work I do with my vocals, it translates out into my life, into my behavior. All of a sudden, I'm more able to have conversations, to set boundaries, and I'm not even thinking about it. I'm not cognitively planning, but as it changes in my body, the way that I move through the world changes. And it's this very bottom up approach to creating change for somebody who is a huge fawner and freezer. It's just incredible to work with the vocals.
Yeah. Awesome. Then expression becomes more like bird song than it is about just meaning and content and
Yes.
content, which we can just get, and it's just like, okay, boundaries been invaded and tweet, 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 tweet.
Right.
And then the person just naturally kind of
Yes.
go, if
Yeah.
they're responsive in any manner, right? They're going to get that bird song. And,
Yes.
Right.
And it's
Okay.
different, right? It's not so constricted and activated. It's just there's a new ease in having some of the conversations and expressing that then leads to really different receptivity on the other side of that too.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much, Elisabeth.
you.
That was fun. I hope.
Yes, this
Yeah.
joy.
Yeah, totally. We speak the same language. Really appreciate you. Is there anything that you want to pitch to the audience?
Well, we are enrolling for the next round of neurosomatic intelligence coaching certification. So if people are interested in learning more about that, you can go to neurosomaticintelligence.com and book a discovery call there, learn more about the program and the work that we teach. And we love to work with somatic therapists, just to bring some practical, actionable tools to work with the nervous system in conjunction with all the other amazing work that people are doing.
Yeah, big celebration for that, Elisabeth. I was all in when you started to talk about nonlinear movements. I'm like, I'm all in.
I love that. Your work is fascinating and you know so much. It's really an honor to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to The Boundless Body with the Somatic Doctor. Please leave a comment, subscribe, and like us on social media.
We're a swarm. We're a colony. We're a multiplicity.
Until next time, be well.